Perfect. Okay, welcome everyone. We have a great talk scheduled for today, and I'm going to let our speaker introduce herself because I think that's more fun. I wanted to give everyone a little bit of information. If you want a letter verifying your attendance, I will put the information on that in the chat, so you can email me preferably after, and then I will get you a letter confirming your attendance. We also will have questions in the chat. I'll have you put them there, and hopefully we'll have a question and answer period at the end where I can read them out or something similar, but we'll try and keep the flow going. If you have questions, please put them in the chat as we go here. Hi, Tom. We've got a pretty awesome speaker lined up here. If you'd like to keep your videos on, feel free. I know internet can be a little goofy sometimes, so I'll probably turn mine off. And then as we get to question and answer, feel free to turn them back on. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our speaker to introduce herself and we'll get started.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Let me just share my screen. We practiced this, so I'm pretty sure I can do this. Oh, hold on. There we go. Can you see my full screen now, Bree?
Yep, looks great.
Oh, awesome. Okay. And I was just saying, I know I've already celebrated my 1 year working from home anniversary, but that doesn't mean that I'm very used to presenting to my own screen in my own room. So I will take I need a moment to get into the groove. My name, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk. My name is Willemijn Doedens. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Donders Institute for Cognition at Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. But I'm going to talk to you today about the work that I conducted as a PhD student at the University of Reading in the UK. And my PhD focused on functional communication and defining real-world communication for aphasia rehabilitation. I'm particularly excited to present to the Focus Aphasia audience today, because for a long time during my PhD, I actually really struggled to figure out if me being interested in functional communication had similar interests as those of researchers who said they were interested in discourse. And that struggle, I think, really taps into some of the questions that I will be talking about today that I dealt with in my PhD. And so hopefully that will also provide some answers to that question. And whether you agree with the issues that I raised in today's talk or not, I am really curious to hear your thoughts and your comments. So I'm currently keeping track of my time, and I'm going to try and stick to roughly 45 minutes, so there actually is time for some feedback. Right, so let's see if this works. There we go. To create a bit of context, I'm also a clinical speech and language therapist, and my interest in functional communication actually comes from my work in the rehab setting and specifically, or for a longer time, in the setting of an aphasia center, where we were working with people with aphasia in the chronic phase after the stroke, and we were very much faced with the challenge of trying to achieve meaningful change in the communicative abilities that people had or wanted to use outside of the clinic. And we were confronted with the challenge almost on a daily basis that some of our clients with similar language impairments were communicating very differently in conversational settings and outside of the aphasia center. So based on the language impairment scores that we had for these people, we couldn't really reliably predict how well they would be able to communicate and what issues that they would be dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And so that very much echoes an observation that Audrey Holland made decades ago when she said, some people with aphasia communicate better than they talk. Now, the fact that we couldn't predict these communicative abilities based on their language impairments indicated to me that there was more than just language that was involved in being able to communicate effectively. Cognitive factors, behavioral factors, and linguistic factors, to me, or I had the suspicion, were at play in enabling some people with aphasia to be effective communicators and other people with aphasia who were very much challenged in the communicative setting. So this is where my interest in functional communication grew. And I believe that in that discrepancy between language testing that we do on a WAB or on a CAT, and the discrepancy between that and the communicative setting, I think there are hints for us or indicators for us that particular factors that might be involved in communication can be good leads or factors that we could target in intervention, or that could help us understand why our treatments at the impairment-based level might or might not generalize to the communicative setting. So that's sort of where my interest started, but let's start at the beginning. So when I talk about functional communication, I'm talking about the use of language for communicative purposes in a day-to-day environment, or as it was defined in the Cochrane review. I haven't actually highlighted the definition, so apologies for that. It's the language or communicational skills sufficient to permit transmission of a message via spoken, written, or non-verbal modalities, or a combination of these channels. So it's something to do with being able to communicate outside of the clinic. And I think most people in aphasia would agree that improving functional communication is one of the long-term goals, or usually one of the long-term goals of speech and language therapy. It's what SLTs or SLPs mention as one of the targets that they eventually want to improve with whatever treatment they provide. So whether they want to achieve that through targeting another behavior and hoping for generalization effects, or whether they are directly targeting communication skills. And it's also one of the targets, one of the key targets that people with aphasia themselves mention as the level of behavior that they would like to see improved. So actually, functional communication is quite central to our field, to aphasia rehabilitation. And as a result of that, actually, a lot of research has grown over the last decades on functional communication. And because it's such a complex behavior, or at least I think because it's such a complex behavior, we've been able to study functional communication through different lenses, so from different perspectives, being formal linguistics, psycholinguistics, pragmatics, cognitive psychology, sociology. So we've had all these different subfields that have used different terminologies to refer to something or roughly the same behavior. So using connected speech, discourse, everyday communication, or the term functional communication. And different elicitation methods have been used throughout the past few decades to try and get at this behavior that is more than just working with words or sentences. So we've used picture descriptions, we've used monologues, dialogues, etc. Now, I would definitely not claim that this is problematic, because I think using all these different perspectives means that we get a richer understanding of functional communication. But my argument in my thesis is that actually we haven't had a central definition of what functional communication is that would help us tie together these different sort of fragmented or subfields that have studied functional communication to translate those findings across all the different studies. And I think not having a consensus on what exactly functional communication is has actually been one of the underlying reasons for some of the issues that currently exist in the field of functional communication. But I'll take you through that. So my argument of my thesis was actually we need a consensus on what we mean by functional communication, because not having that is at the root of some of the issues in terms of assessment, treatment, and creating a stronger evidence base for our clinical profession. And so in terms of assessment, there's a large number of assessment instruments that are currently being used to measure functional communication. They're highly heterogeneous. I think that's how I should pronounce it. And they roughly claim to measure the same thing, but if you carefully look at them, they measure overlapping but slightly distinct constructs. And actually, I would not be surprised if this lack of consensus on what functional communication is also underpins the fact that surveys actually show that in clinical practice, we still rely heavily on impairment-based tests to measure therapy outcomes, even though our goals are usually at the level of functional communication. Now, in terms of treatment, it still is difficult, or it remains difficult to find reliable, consistent generalization of therapy effects to functional communication. And again, I would argue it might partly be because we haven't clearly defined what functional communication is, so what exactly the target is that we're working towards. And for the same reason, it's been reported that there are more and more interventions that are targeted at functional communication, but very few that actually target the skills of the person with aphasia to communicate better. And I think, again, part of the problem might be not having clearly defined what that behavior is. Hold on, I just need to move these screens. And finally, we have been limited in our ability to synthesize results across studies looking at the effectiveness of speech and language therapy on something like functional communication. That was also reported in the Cochrane review, for example, and they explicitly said part of the reason was because there were so many different assessment instruments that were used. And so my argument would be having a centralized definition of functional communication could at least help in solving these issues or in addressing these issues, because having a clear target that we all agree on is that final sort of goal that we're working towards, and that specifically describes behavioral and sort of cognitive, what that entails behaviorally and cognitively, will make it easier to differentiate between the assessment instruments. It will help us define what aspects of functional communication are measured by what instrument, and which instruments measure the same thing and which ones don't. And it will allow us, in terms of treatment, for example, to specifically hypothesize why we would and why we wouldn't expect generalization effects, potentially because of differences in task demands between two different behaviors. So one we're targeting and one we're trying to achieve change in. And finally, similarly as for the assessment instruments, I think having a clear definition of functional communication would help us more clearly organize and define which data from which studies we could pull, because they are actually tapping into the same behavior, and which ones we couldn't or we can't. So that's sort of the framework that the argumentation that I started my PhD with, and the aim of my time spent as a PhD student was to get a better understanding of what functional communication is in post-stroke aphasia. And my thesis was roughly divided into 3 parts. One, looking at, can we find a theoretical definition of what functional communication might be, or what real-world communication comprises? And once we have such a definition, how can we use that to evaluate the existing instruments that we use in clinical practice to assess functional communication? And finally, can it help us in determining how we can, in the lab, experimentally investigate functional communication in an ecologically valid manner? Now, I sort of decided my main focus for today's talk was going to be the sort of theoretical definition, but I definitely want to make sure that I do mention or briefly talk about question 2 and question 3. And well, I'm just going to make sure that I'm going to do that within the time. Starting with the theoretical definition. So my aim was never to come up with a framework or a definition of functional communication on my own. I don't pretend to have that kind of expertise, but I did sort of start the project, and I was acutely aware of the fact that there is a lot of research outside of our field on communication that potentially we were not optimally using or learning from or benefiting from. So the question that I attempted to answer was, how is communication defined in the control literature? And is there something there that we can learn from and that we can apply to aphasia rehabilitation? So I reviewed historical models or definitions or framework of communication in the control literature, and I selected a comprehensive framework that I deemed suitable for aphasia rehabilitation. And after that, I reviewed literature from the control literature and the aphasia literature on each component of that framework to see where to build the argument of the use of that framework, but also to identify gaps in knowledge that we have in our field that have been investigated in the control literature. So starting with finding a suitable framework, we had some criteria that we wanted the framework to fit into. One being, as a good scientist, we prefer a simple model versus or over a complex model, not only because that's easier to start with, but also because I figured, well, we're going to apply it to aphasia rehabilitation, but there needs to be some room for adaptations and add-ons once we do start working with this framework in our field. So we'd rather start simple and make it complex as we go along. And we wanted it to be comprehensive. So if you look at the historical models, and I think they should be showing up, yeah, there are quite a lot of models of communication, and most of them, or a lot of them actually, focus on one specific aspect of communication. So there are models of audience design, so how people in communication prepare their message specifically for a particular kind of conversation partner. There are models, I'll just briefly go back. The one in the center is the classic Shannon and Weaver model that has been criticized actually for being one directional. So really focusing on the one way communication. And there are models that only focus on, for example, gesture or the use of nonverbal communication. And what we wanted was something that didn't have a specific focus, but tried to encapsulate communication as a whole, and at the same time try to describe internal, so cognitive processes, but also external factors such as environmental influences on the communication process. And actually, as we sort of went through the different models, there was in the psycholinguistics literature, there was a framework that described functional, or what we would call functional communication, by Herbert Clark. Well, let's see, there we go. And he defines communication as it is used in the real world as situated language use. And he defines that as something that is interactive, multimodal, and contextual. He doesn't actually use the phrase contextual, he uses the word common ground. It's based in common ground, and I'll get to that in a second. So what he means by interactive is that communication in the real world, more often than not, happens between two or more people. And so just the bare fact that you are talking to somebody rather than just on your own in what happens usually in a testing setting, it means that there's another person who can, for example, tell you whether your message is comprehensible or not. There's somebody there that can help you if you get stuck. So that's a massive difference already between an isolated setting in which your language processing is tested and in a communicative setting. Multimodal means that there are different channels through which information can be exchanged. One being verbal, so whatever you can say with words, but also the use of gesture, facial expressions, body posture, intonation, and specifically, of course, for people with aphasia, the use of writing or the use of drawing. And all of those different messages all comprise into one composite message that helps you understand or helps you convey whatever you're expressing. And so again, a typical language test will, for example, only look at verbal output. But if you want to understand functional or somebody's communicative ability, if you were to only look at their verbal output, you might be missing out on quite a lot of information that is exchanged through other channels. And finally, so common ground, that's a bit of a monster of a term. And Clark actually breaks it down into 3 subcomponents. Contextual or common ground can exist even before you start communicating, because the person that you're talking to, you might have shared experiences or knowledge with, for example, because it's a friend. And that context that is there can already influence how you communicate or how easy it is to communicate with somebody. Secondly, there's the communicative context, meaning that as you're having a conversation, there's a context that builds. And that also has an influence on the way that you communicate and potentially on the ease with which you might be able to communicate. And finally, there's the physical environment. So again, that's something to take into account, and that will have an influence on how people communicate. So Clark defines real-world communication by these 3 necessary components. And before I get back to the questions that I started with, you might be thinking, well, yes, but not all communicative settings in the real world are interactive. I mean, I have left so many voice messages on WhatsApp. Those are definitely not interactive, and yet it is me using my language in the real world. And Clark, luckily, has an answer to that challenge, or has a suggestion on how to deal with that. Namely, that he has identified a basic sort of setting in which we should study real-world communication, which he and other researchers have defined as face-to-face communication. Now, for this past year, it might have been slightly different, but let's say usually face-to-face communication has been the most common and pervasive form of communication. And research has shown that this is also true for people with aphasia. It's the most common sort of setting in the real world in which we communicate. It's universal to all societies. It's the basis for typical language acquisition. And typically it doesn't require specific special education or special skills, which, for example, writing or reading would require. And Clark's argument is, if you want to understand the way people use language in the real world, this is where you start to look at how all these mechanisms work and what factors are of influence. And once we understand this setting, we can think about how other types of variations might be sort of derived from that. So, for example, you can think about if somebody's on the I don't know, can you see my cursor actually? Because I might be. I see somebody nodding. Yeah. Great. Okay. You might be in a situation where you're speaking to somebody on the phone, so the person can hear you and they can hear your intonation, but they might not be able to see your gestures. So there's a number of channels of information that drop away. Let's see what kind of examples I have. So you might be speaking to one person, but a sort of variation on that theme might be that you're talking to a lot of different people, and how that varies from this basic face-to-face setting. I think I use the example of a voicemail message where it's not interactive, right? Where you can, well, voicemail actually, a few of the channels also drop away, but there will be examples where you can use you might be recording a video message, but you don't have another person who's helping you construct this dialogue with you. So the key argument here is, yes, we can start to understand all these variations by starting by looking at and investigating face-to-face communication. And so it's relatively simple. We have 3 components that describe situated language use that already help us differentiate situated language use or functional communication from language as we study it on standardized tests. And very clearly, as I already sort of described, language, as Clark calls it in vacuo, is not interactive, it's usually not multimodal, and it doesn't take into account context, because if we're doing a picture naming task, actually these are so controlled that the word that you named, then the second word that you name will be not related to each other, because we don't want any of the influences of the other words. But this means that we can define how they are different, and we can start thinking about what factors play a role and what demands are present in the one situation that are not present in the other. Oh gosh, you guys. Yes, there we go. And so you can think about, okay, what then makes communication compared to language processing in isolation easier or more difficult? What are the challenges that people face? So if you think about interactivity, I already said there's somebody else who might give you feedback and who might help you construct your, might actually make communication easier for some people with aphasia. The fact that while you're talking, you have to monitor the other person to see if they're looking confused or not, might actually be a cognitive challenge. And similarly, and these are just some examples, but similarly for the multimodal aspect, the fact that in terms of comprehension and production, there are more channels that you can rely on. So you can words, but if you can't find a word, you can use gesture or you can draw something, might actually be really beneficial and might make communication easier for some people with aphasia. But the fact that you have to find these other modalities and use them, and in terms of comprehension, that you have to integrate all that information that's sort of sent your way, might actually make communication much more difficult for others. And again, the same argument can be made for context. So the fact that you have a context of a conversation means that it can restrict the potential interpretations of what somebody is saying. So it means if somebody gives you a word, a single word out of nowhere, we might have a million options of what it could mean. Whereas if you're talking about dinner, it means the potential interpretations are already restricted. So that might make communication easier. In another sense, the fact that you have to keep track of a whole conversation and where the conversation is going might mean that memory load might make it more difficult for you to keep track of what's being said. And another aspect of context, we usually assume that it's easier to talk to somebody that we know because you don't have to use elaborate explanations. There might be some things that are understood between two people that are friends, but the fact that you might be able to then select particular elements of your message rather than telling somebody the whole story might also be challenging for some people with aphasia, who might not be able to manage all those options and select from a long message that they have in mind. So having that framework not only helps us differentiate between language and communication, but it breaks down that complex concept, and it helps us start to think about where are the challenges and where are potentially the benefits for some people with aphasia. And furthermore, it also actually helps us to think about in potentially a slightly different way of how different elicitation methods and what kind of behaviors different elicitation methods might be tapping into, and whether we have reason to believe they might be tapping into something that is slightly different than this ultimate thing of functional communication might be. So if we have the framework and we put it next to, for example, a dialogue, or generally what we understand a dialogue to be, it would be interactive. It can be multimodal. It isn't always, but it can very much be multimodal. And there usually is a context as well that we sort of have to define, or that happens. Even if it's just a conversation, there will be some degree of context. But if we look at a monologue, an elicitation monologue, it is already quite clear that it's not interactive. Now, that's not necessarily problematic. There are reasons why monologues are used a lot in our field, because actually it's easier to control in an experimental setting, because there isn't a conversation partner that brings lots of variability with it. But at the same time, it means we have to think about, we're putting somebody in a situation that might be slightly different from the challenge that people face in day-to-day life. And I think this framework helps make that more concrete and helps us think about what the difference then between these two tasks might be. And similarly, for a picture description task. These are usually not multimodal, so there's even more factors that are removed from the language in situ, and so and more reason to believe why these two tasks are so different: a picture description versus language as we use it in day-to-day life. So as a brief summary, gosh, time's flying. We've proposed a definition of functional communication borrowed from Herbert Clark, saying that functional communication is interactive, multimodal, and contextual. And it provides us with a starting point for studying functional communication, namely in a face-to-face setting. We can use that as sort of our basic setting in which to study this behavior. And this definition helps us think about and hypothesize the cognitive, behavioral, and linguistic challenges that occur or are present in day-to-day communication, and how that compares to language on isolated or decontextualized tests that we commonly use. And finally, it can help us differentiate between the different terminologies and elicitation tasks that are used in the field to capture or to better understand functional communication. Right, so I have a little bit of time left to talk about what we then did with this theoretical framework. And the first thing that we did was to look at how functional communication is currently assessed within our field. So the question was, how is it currently measured in the aphasia literature? And are these instruments that we can find, are they in line, or do they fit with this theoretical definition? So we conducted a systematic search to look for instruments that are mentioned in the literature that are used to capture functional communication. We discussed, so the paper is available and it's open access, but we discussed the different types of instruments and the criticism that already exists of these instruments. We evaluated how well they fitted with that definition of interactivity, multimodality, and contextual. And then we ended up selecting the one instrument that we thought fitted best, so had the highest ecological validity, actually. And so this is the list of instruments that we identified through our search. And as you can see, I mean, this basically underscores the argument that I made at the beginning of the talk. There are a lot of instruments. And not only do they vary on how they define functional communication, they actually also vary in how they measure functional communication. So there are quite a few standardized tests that can be used. Some of them are have norm scores, and usually they use role play between the clinician and the person with aphasia to elicit or to pretend like you're in a communicative setting and then elicit a particular response and see how well or how communicative somebody is. There are a lot of observational profiles that are used in the literature, some rated by the clinicians, other rated by the client or the person with aphasia themselves or a proxy, and some based on a direct observation of a particular interaction, and others based on a general sort of observations of communication at home. And finally, there are tools that are based on more of a linguistic analysis of connected speech. So these are usually focused on verbal output, and there are what I would call sociological analyses of interaction. So that would be conversation analysis that looks at functional communication. And what we did, this is just a brief overview of what we did here. We basically did a tick the box exercise. So we looked at each instrument and looked at how do they define functional communication, and how do they evaluate performance on the test or communicative performance. Do they define it as something that is interactive? Do they take into account all modalities, and do they take into account the influence of context? And in addition to that, because we wanted to give a recommendation to clinicians that about something that they could actually use in clinic, we also wanted to find a tool or an instrument that measured functional communication as objectively as possible. And we were looking for something preferably that was standardized, so that could really easily be applied in clinic or used in clinic. Now, what we found, actually, we ended up with 2 instruments that fitted, in a theoretical sense, fitted really well with our theoretical definition of functional communication. And that was conversation analysis and the scenario test. And so in the end, because of the criteria that we use and because we wanted a tool that was actually usable as something, as an outcome measure of therapy, for example, we ended up choosing the scenario test because it's a standardized tool that aims to quantify communication in some way. Not saying that the scenario test is a perfect test. There were also some limitations, but in a theoretical sense, it came closest to defining functional communication in a comprehensive way, in line with the theoretical framework. And interestingly, at the time that we published our theoretical sort of framework and the preliminary version of this paper, which was in 2018, this was around the time that the COS Roma was trying to agree on an outcome measure for aphasia treatment research on the level of communication. And initially, there was quite some disagreement, I think, or they struggled to reach a minimum level of consensus on an instrument, and they ended up using the framework that we proposed in our preprint and that I've discussed here, and they, independently from us, also ended up recommending the scenario test as an outcome measure. So as a brief summary, this sort of exercise showed us that the theoretical definition or framework that we have that describes functional communication actually helps differentiate between different assessment instruments. And this first exercise or application of the framework showed us that there is a fruitfulness or a usefulness in applying or studying and discussing functional communication in a more systematic and theoretical way. And using the framework, it also provided us with leads for future development of assessment instruments. Because even though we selected one instrument, based on the framework, we could also make some recommendations for further improvements for future assessment instruments. So that was actually, we were quite pleased with that result and how that worked. And I see I have a few minutes left to talk about the final component of the thesis, where we talked about or investigated how we could apply the framework to experimental investigations of functional communication. And so what we wanted, and I think that's also to do with my background. I have a background in psychology, and what I really wanted was more research, systematic research into causal links between particular or causal influences of particular factors or mechanisms that were influencing people with aphasia's ability to communicate effectively or not. And I think one of the ways in investigating that is conducting well-controlled experiments. Now, functional communication is a very difficult thing to investigate in an experimental setting because it's such a complex behavior. And one of the things that also makes it really tricky is that you want control, but you also want to stay really close to this sort of spontaneous thing that is communication. So one way of thinking about this or approaching this was our choice to use this theoretical framework that sort of could put at ease some of our worries in terms of, we felt like we could increase the ecological validity of the experimental, potentially do this, of the experimental setting, but still have enough control to bring about or to implement particular manipulations, experimental manipulations, and then see what kind of influence that has on behavior within the lab setting. And so again, we wanted to find an experimental paradigm that fitted with the theoretical framework and that was potentially not being utilized at all or not enough within our field. So again, I went outside of our field to the control literature to see how is communication studied there, because there's a lot of research there and I think that we can benefit more from this existing work. Now we did actually do an experimental investigation and I didn't plan on talking about that too much, but I wanted to mainly talk to you about the paradigm that we ended up using. And so one of the paradigms that is used in the control literature quite a lot to study different aspects of communication is the language game. And it comes in different forms and different setups. But the key sort of idea behind it is that two people engage in a particular game. So person A is given a particular kind of information. In this case, they are given a particular setup of objects. It might be cards or whatever you give people to work with. And person B on the other side has the same objects, but they're not in the same setup or they're not in the same placement, basically. There's a low barrier in between the two people, so they can't actually see the other person's objects. And the two people have to work together and they have to actually communicate to each other or with each other to achieve the goal, which is for person B to create the same setup in front of them that person A already has. So it solves an issue in the sense that it gives two people a goal that they have to work towards, which also means that we have something of an accuracy measure, which is quite difficult to get in terms of communicating. And it gives them time it means that they have to talk about this together. They have to exchange particular types of information. And it means they have to have a conversation. So it's not a matter of two words exchanged and the task is done. There is a bit of context there of a conversation. And within that conversation, people can decide for themselves how they achieve that. So even though it's within a structured setting, there is some sort of spontaneity in terms of people decide what they say. And as you can see, I've added some of the literature. So the top two lines are the studies from the control literature or examples of studies from the control literature. But the bottom two lines are studies within aphasia where this kind of setup has been used. So I'm definitely not saying that this hasn't been applied and this is completely new to our field, but I do think the application or the way that this kind of paradigm can be applied to systematically investigate factors that influence communication for people with aphasia hasn't been done so much. So often it's been used as a therapy outcome measure and particularly to study multimodal communication in people with aphasia. And so what this means is that actually this task fits within our theoretical framework. So it's an interactive task. It's always between at least two people. It's multimodal and it's contextual because there's a longer conversation that happens and there's particular objects or things that people work with. And interestingly, and most usefully, you can manipulate all these aspects. So the barrier for some experiments has been raised, meaning that not all modalities can be used. You can vary the type of objects that people work with, and you can vary the degree to which people can interact. So it gives this experimental flexibility. And there's lots of different things that you can look at and you can investigate. As I said, it gives you an accuracy measure. So how well do pairs communicate together in the end? Do they achieve what they set out to achieve? You can look at how long it takes people. You can look at aspects of the interaction, of the multimodal communication, of the context and the use of context. And interestingly, you can look at developments over time. So you can look at as people get more experience on the task, if they repeat it a number of times, do these aspects of communication change as a result of that? For example, do people get more efficient or do they not really learn based on experience? So it provides a really rich type of data that you can look at. And so briefly to conclude this section, so the framework that we've identified helps us consider the ecological validity of experimental research. And I think we could do a lot more with this kind of experimental setup to better understand how communication works or might be impaired for people with aphasia. And I don't think we've used it to our advantage enough yet. And more generally, as a conclusion to today's talk, as we're coming up to 45 minutes, in my PhD thesis, I propose a central sort of theoretical definition that we might use to define functional communication and thereby to provide structure to the study of functional communication, which I believe will benefit assessment, treatment, and in the end also the strength of the evidence base that we have of our empirical research, especially in terms of the effectiveness of speech and language therapy on functional communication. I think it helps us differentiate between what language is and what we test when we test just isolated language processing versus language when it's used in the real world. And it helps us define how different types of language use that we have studied throughout the years might tap into aspects or completely tap into what we would define as functional communication. And so going forward, I think differentiation and specification of what kind of behavior we're looking at is key for our field as a whole to move forward. And so before I finish, I want to say a big thanks to my supervisors, Lottie Metjard and Arpita Bose, for their brilliant supervision. Lydia Lambert was a student who worked on some of my data, and Lucy Letzer developed a really cool infographic of which some of the images were taken, or from which some of the images were taken, and the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences at the University of Reading, who funded and facilitated my research. So thank you very much. And thank you very much for giving me the time to present my work. Oh yeah, in terms of, I did give people pen and paper as well to use during the task. And I had the barrier set up that one side that of where the pen and paper were, there was no barrier there. So the room was in front of the people, and then to the side, I had pen and paper there for them to use on both participants' side, and there was no barrier. So they could actually push pen and paper towards the other person, and they could see the other person draw something.
It is interesting trying to set up something that is